Hey guys, and welcome to Historical Chess Games, the series in which I analyze games from throughout history so we can learn about how chess has developed over time. I'll be structuring the series by looking at games of specific top players throughout the past few centuries chronologically. Today, for the first installment of Historical Chess Games, we're going to start looking at the games of Francois Philidor, a French chess master from the 1700s. Oh, and excuse my pronunciation if I mispronounce chess players' names in this series. I'm not the most gifted in that department, so if you know the name pronunciation of the chess player, just write it in the comments so I can learn for future videos. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a game played in 1749 between Philidor and an anonymous opponent. Okay, so Philidor begins e4, the king's pawn opening, and his opponent responds with e5, the double king's pawn opening. So now Philidor plays bishop c4, the bishop opening, which is much less popular nowadays than knight f3 or the king's knight variation. His opponent responds bishop c5. And this is a little bit, I think, worse than knight f6, which puts immediate pressure on this e4 pawn, but it isn't terrible. So here, Philidor plays c3, which is preparing to push d4 and break up the center. I think that knight f3 would have been better because it develops this knight and also accomplishes the tactic of putting pressure on this e-pawn in one move instead of two moves. So now black plays knight f6. But I think that he could have considered d5, which looks like it loses a pawn to bishop takes c5, but it doesn't because black has knight f6, attacking both this bishop and the e4 pawn. So white can respond with d4, which is attacking this bishop, and the pawn, obviously, but after e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, and castles. I think that black is in a better position than he would have been. Okay, but let's go back. So here he does play knight f6, and now we see what we were expecting from white earlier, d4, blowing up the center. E takes d4, and c takes d4, exchanging these pawns. And now we have bishop b6. And white is in a good position. His bishop on c4 is attacking this weak square of f7, and he has these two pawns controlling a lot of the area of the center. Okay, so here we see knight c3. And I think Philidor could have considered e5, attacking the knight, forcing it to move, and creating this strong forward pawn structure. But he does play c3. And here, black castles. So there is a little trick here that commonly arises in the Italian variation of the four knights game, and that's knight takes e4. And you might say, hey, doesn't this immediately just lose a piece to knight takes e4? But it actually doesn't. So I'll give you a few seconds to try and find the move, and write your answer in the comments below. Okay, did you find it? It's this move, d5, forking the two minor pieces. So no matter what, black's going to gain back his material. And note that even a tricky move like bishop b5 check doesn't work because black can just play c6 attacking this bishop, and one of these pieces is going to fall. Okay, but he does play castles. And now Philidor plays knight g2. We see black play c6, planning on d5 later. And now we see bishop d3, protecting this pawn. We do see d5, and now we see Philidor finding play e5, attacking this knight. Black brings his knight back to e8. It's important that he doesn't put his knight on d7 because he's planning on developing this knight to d7 as the c6 square is currently occupied by a pawn, so we can't develop that way. Okay, so here we have bishop e3. And now black plays f6, trying to break up this forward pawn structure. Philidor plays queen d2, but I would have liked to see him play something like f4. So then after f takes e5, we have f recaptures e5 to maintain our structure here. But he does play d2. And now we see f takes e5, d takes e5, and now we see bishop e6. So now we have knight f4, which I don't think is that good. It threatens this bishop, and black responds with queen e7, which protects the bishop. But at the same time, if he had played something like knight c7, that's a little bit better, because now if we capture, black can recapture knight takes e6 and bring this knight that was formerly really passive on the e8 square to this more active square of e6, so he can recapture with tempo. And if that happens, then I think black is in a little bit of better situation. But he does play queen e7, and this isn't great because if you see that the queen on d8 was protecting this bishop here on b6. So after the queen moves, now we have bishop takes b6, and black is forced to recapture with the pawn. A captures b6. And although black gains a semi-open A file, his pawn structure here is not so great. Here I think that Philidor should capture on e6, and after the queen recaptures, he can play f4 and reinforce this pawn structure, be a little bit more aggressive, but instead he chooses a slightly more passive option, which is just castles. So now we see knight d7, and here we see knight takes e6, queen takes e6, and we see f4. So he reaches the same position anyways, but just with castling first. He possibly could have considered rook a e1, which sort of brings his rook into the action more and accomplishes the same thing about protecting this e-pawn. But at the same time, it does tie this c3 knight down to this a2 pawn, because otherwise this rook is just going to come and take it. So now we see knight c7, and here we see rook a e1. And this is really threatening the idea of pushing f5, which will super disrupt black's position. We see g6, anticipating f5, and now Philidor plays h3. Philidor has a strong attack here with later ideas of playing g4 and now f5 and really breaking up the structure. And that's really helped out by having his queen focusing here, his bishop focusing here, and his two rooks. So really what this tells us is that when you want to initiate an attack on a certain side, you want to make sure that all your big pieces are contributing to that attack. So here we have d4, which attacks this knight, but after knight e4, which Philidor plays, this pawn is sort of in a weird position. Here we have h6, and Philidor plays b3, which is the idea that it's cutting off this rook from taking here because now the queen can recapture. But I think that Philidor really needs to realize that this pawn doesn't matter, and he should be focusing on his kingside attack. So now we see b5, which is another move that I think just doesn't focus on where the action is really happening on the king side of the board right now. But Philidor plays g4, which is following up with his earlier plan of pushing these pawns. He potentially could have played knight d6, which puts the knight in a very good position, but g4 I think is fine. So now we see knight d5, and we see knight g3, which is really adding pressure to this f5 square. We see knight e3, which, I don't really think is that good. Here, Philidor captures, rook takes e3, which gives up the exchange, which is fine because it still keeps his strong attack going. But I definitely think he could have played something like rook f2, and after, knight b6, he could have played bishop takes g6. And, you might say, hey, can't the queen just recapture? Queen takes g6, and black is hugely up in this position. Yes, but the thing is that afterwards, white has f5, and now after queen g5, we have queen takes d4, and after knight d5 and f6, we have this really dangerous initiative. So yes, we're down a knight, but we have plenty of compensation in the form of this very aggressive position. But here he does trade down, and we have d takes e3. After queen takes e3, we have rook takes a2. So now we have rook e1, and then we have queen takes b3. And I don't really think this is that great because it takes the queen away from blocking off these pawns, and black could easily accomplish the same thing with something like rook b2. But he does play queen takes b3, and this allows Philidor to play this move, queen e4, which is threatening queen takes g6 check, and a dangerous attack on his opponent's king. But at the same time, it's still threatening pushing e6 with the pawn backed up by these two strong pieces. So now we see queen back to e6, which blocks this pawn. And I think that here, Philidor should really capture queen takes g6 check, which kind of forces his opponent to capture here, and then after we can recapture bishop takes g6, and we have a really clear shot for our pawns to march forward, and also our bishop is going to be here defending the square that the pawns are planning to promote on. So that's just a very aggressive position. But instead, Philidor decides to play f5. We see g takes f5, and now we see g takes f5, and we see queen d5. Now we see queen takes d5 check. We see c takes d5, and now bishop takes b5. And I think that the positions are somewhat equal. Black has a rook for white's bishop, but at the same time, white has these very strong forward pawns, and he has a lot of compensation there. So now we see knight b6. And now f6. We see rook b2 attacking the bishop, and so we see bishop d3. Now we see king f7, and we see bishop f5. Now knight c4, and knight h5. And like I said earlier, here white is really focusing his pieces on his attack. He's getting all his pieces activated and working together to push these pawns forward and eliminate the king. Now we see rook g8 check, and we see a block bishop g4. And here we see black play knight d2, and this is a blunder. So can you find the move which puts white extremely far ahead? I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video, and if you find the move, write your answer in the comments below. Okay, did you find it? The move is e6 check, and black is essentially lost. Either the king will be checkmated by the advancing pawns, or these pawns will promote. Either way, it's going to be completely game over. So now we see king g6 getting out of the check, and we see f7 threatening to promote. F takes g8 equals queen. So we have rook f8, which stops the advance of this pawn. And now we have knight f4 check. We see king g7, and now we have bishop h5. And at this point, Philidor's opponent resigns, because you can see that in this position, e7 is coming with this bishop now protecting the f-pawn, so the king can't just recapture. Sorry about that. So you could expect something like e7, now rook takes f7, and now e8 equals queen. And it will be checkmate in a few moves. Okay, so this was a great game for Philidor. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And stay tuned, because I'll be back with more historical games soon. Thanks for watching.